John Mitchell wasn't thinking about fortune when he drove the shovel into the dry California soil behind his modest rental house in Grass Valley. He was thinking about tomatoes, maybe some bell peppers. His landlord had finally given him permission to plant a small vegetable garden, and after 3 years of asking, he wasn't going to waste the opportunity. It was a Saturday morning in late March, unseasonably warm, and he had the whole day ahead of him. The sun was already climbing over the pines that lined the back fence, casting long shadows across the patchy lawn he'd been meaning to fix for months. He'd borrowed the shovel from his neighbor 2 days earlier and kept forgetting to return it. Now he was glad he had it. The ground was harder than he expected. John worked as a warehouse supervisor at a lumber distributor 40 minutes away in Auburn. The pay was decent enough to cover rent, utilities, his truck payment and groceries, with a little left over for the occasional dinner out with his girlfriend Sarah. But decent wasn't the same as comfortable. He'd been carrying credit card debt from an emergency room visit 2 years prior when he didn't have insurance. The bill had been over $8,000. He'd been chipping away at it ever since, but the interest made it feel like running on a treadmill. Every month he'd pay $300, and the balance would drop by maybe half that. It wore on him. Sarah told him not to stress about it, that they'd figure it out together, but he knew she had her own student loans to worry about. They'd been talking about moving in together, maybe finding a bigger place, but the numbers never quite worked. So for now, he stayed in the rental on Willow Creek Road, a small 2-bedroom with thin walls and a backyard that nobody had touched in years. The property itself wasn't much to look at. The house had been built sometime in the early 70s, a single-story structure with faded yellow siding and a roof that probably needed replacing soon. The landlord, an older man named Ed Porter, who lived 3 hours away in Sacramento, had inherited the place from his uncle and mostly treated it as a passive income stream. Ed wasn't a bad landlord, just distant. He'd fix things when they broke, but he wasn't interested in upgrades or improvements. The backyard reflected that neglect. It was a rectangle of packed dirt, weeds, and a few stubborn patches of crabgrass. An old wooden fence surrounded it, warped and graying. There was a rusted barbecue grill that had been there when John moved in, and a coiled garden hose attached to a spigot near the back door. Not much else. But it was space, and space meant possibility. John had always liked the idea of growing his own food. His grandfather had kept a vegetable garden in Oregon when John was a kid, and he remembered the taste of tomatoes picked fresh off the vine, still warm from the sun. There was something satisfying about it, something grounding. So when Ed finally said yes to the garden idea during a phone call about a leaking faucet, John felt a small surge of motivation. He went to the hardware store that weekend and bought seed packets, a bag of fertilizer, and a cheap pair of work gloves. He figured he'd start small, maybe a 4x8 plot near the back fence where the sun hit longest during the day. Nothing fancy, just enough to see if he could make something grow. The first few scoops of dirt came up easily enough, dry, loose topsoil mixed with small rocks and the occasional root. But about 6 inches down, the shovel hit something solid. Not a rock exactly. It didn't have that heavy, immovable feeling of stone. It was more like a dull thud, the kind of resistance you'd get from hitting wood buried under dirt. John frowned and tried again a few inches to the left. Same thing. He knelt down and brushed away some of the loose soil with his gloved hand, revealing a dark, weathered surface. Wood, definitely. Old wood. It looked like a plank, or maybe the top of a crate. His first thought was that someone had buried trash back here years ago, maybe construction debris from when the house was built. It wouldn't be the first time he'd found junk in a rental yard. He'd pulled out half a rusted lawnmower from a flower bed at his last place, but this felt different. The wood was placed deliberately, not just tossed in a hole. It was level, almost like a lid. John stood up and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked around the yard, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. His neighbor's dog wasn't barking for once. No cars passing on the street out front, just the faint hum of a lawnmower a few houses down. He felt a strange prickle of curiosity mixed with caution. Part of him wanted to call Sarah and tell her what he'd found, but he didn't even know what it was yet. It could be nothing. Probably was nothing. Still, he kept digging. He worked carefully now, clearing dirt away from the edges of the wooden surface. It took about 20 minutes to expose the full outline. It was a rectangular wooden box, roughly 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, buried about 8 inches below the surface. The wood was old, the kind that splinters easily when you touch it, darkened by years of moisture and soil. There were no markings on it, no handles or hinges visible from the top. Just planks nailed together in a crude, functional way. John's heart was beating a little faster now. He told himself it was probably just old tools, maybe some gardening equipment the previous tenant had buried and forgotten about. People did weird things, but the box looked deliberate. Someone had gone to the trouble of building it and placing it here. That meant something. He tried to pry up one of the planks with the edge of the shovel, but the wood was too brittle. It cracked and splintered under the pressure. He stopped and thought for a moment, then went into the house and grabbed a crowbar from the small toolbox he kept in the hall closet. When he came back out, he knelt beside the box and worked the crowbar under one of the longer planks. It took some effort, but the nails gave way with a rusty screech and the plank came loose. He set it aside and looked down into the gap he'd created. Inside the box was fabric, dark, heavy fabric, maybe canvas or burlap, folded over itself multiple times. It looked old, stained with dirt and moisture. John hesitated. His mind was racing through possibilities now, most of them mundane. Old clothes, rags, maybe documents, though they'd be ruined after all this time underground. He reached in and carefully lifted the fabric. It was heavier than he expected. He pulled it out and set it on the ground beside him, then unfolded it slowly. And that's when he saw it. Gold. Not jewelry. Not coins. At least not at first glance. It was raw gold. Irregular chunks of it. Each piece about the size of a golf ball or smaller. Some with rough edges and others more rounded. They glinted dully in the morning sunlight, unmistakable even under a coating of dirt. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all wrapped together in the fabric like someone had been in a hurry to hide them. John stared. His hands were shaking slightly. He picked up one of the pieces and turned it over. It was heavy, far heavier than a rock that size would be. He rubbed some of the dirt off with his thumb and the gold underneath gleamed brighter. Pure. Real. He sat back on his heels and tried to process what he was seeing. Gold. In his backyard. Buried under 8 inches of dirt in a rental house in Grass Valley, California. It didn't make sense. He looked around again, half expecting someone to walk up and tell him this was a prank, that he was on some kind of hidden camera show. But the yard was still empty. The dog down the street barked once and went quiet. A car drove past on Willow Creek Road, its engine fading into the distance. John looked back down at the gold in his hands and felt a surge of something he couldn't quite name. Disbelief, excitement, fear maybe. Because if this was real, if this was actually gold, then everything was about to change. He carefully rewrapped the pieces in the fabric and set them aside, then looked back into the box. There was more. He reached in and pulled out another bundle, this one smaller but just as heavy. He unwrapped it. More gold, smaller nuggets this time, mixed with what looked like gold dust collected in a small leather pouch that had deteriorated with age. He kept digging. There were 4 bundles in total, each containing raw gold in various forms. No coins yet, no bars, just raw ore and nuggets like someone had pulled them straight from a mine and hidden them here. John spread everything out on the ground and tried to estimate how much there was. He had no idea what gold was worth, not off the top of his head, but he knew it wasn't cheap. Even accounting for the weight of the dirt and rock still clinging to some of the pieces, there had to be several pounds here, maybe 5, maybe more. He pulled out his phone and opened the browser, his fingers fumbling slightly as he typed. Current price of gold per ounce. The results loaded. Gold was trading at just over $1,900 per ounce. He did some quick math in his head. A pound was 16 ounces. If he had 5 pounds of gold, that was 80 ounces. 80 times 1,900. He stopped and did the calculation again on his phone's calculator to make sure. $152,000, and that was assuming it was only 5 pounds. It could be more. It could be significantly more. John set the phone down and stared at the pile of gold on the ground beside him. $150,000, maybe more. just sitting in his backyard, hidden under the spot where he'd planned to plant tomatoes. His mind was spinning now, jumping from thought to thought. Where had it come from? Who had buried it? How long had it been here? And the biggest question, the one that made his stomach tighten with a mix of hope and anxiety, was he allowed to keep it? The rental agreement he'd signed with Ed Porter didn't say anything about buried treasure. Why would it? But this was Ed's property. Did that mean the gold belonged to Ed? Or did it belong to whoever had buried it, assuming that person could be identified? Or did it belong to John because he'd found it? He didn't know. He realized, sitting there in the dirt with a fortune spread out in front of him, that he had no idea what the law said about something like this. And that scared him, because if he did this wrong, if he made the wrong move or told the wrong person, he could lose everything. Or worse, he could get into legal trouble. He'd heard stories about people finding money or valuables and getting sued by a dozen different parties claiming ownership. He didn't want that. He couldn't afford that. He carefully rewrapped the gold and placed it back in the box, then covered the box with the plank he'd removed. He shoveled the loose dirt back over it, not burying it completely, just enough to hide it from casual view. Then he stood up, brushed the dirt off his jeans and went inside. He needed to think. He needed to figure out his next move, and he needed to do it carefully, because this wasn't the kind of thing you got a second chance at. Inside the house, John paced back and forth in the small living room. His mind was still racing. He wanted to call Sarah immediately to tell her everything, but something stopped him. Not because he didn't trust her. He did, completely. But he needed to have a plan first. He needed to understand what he was dealing with before he brought anyone else into it, even her. He sat down on the couch and opened his laptop, then started searching. Finding gold on rental property. Who owns buried treasure? California law found valuables. The results were a mix of legal blogs, news articles about treasure finds, and forum discussions that didn't give him any clear answers. The law seemed murky, inconsistent. Some sources said that if you found something on someone else's property, it belonged to the property owner. Others said it depended on whether the original owner could be identified. Still others mentioned something called treasure trove, an old legal concept that said hidden valuables of unknown ownership could belong to the finder. But even that wasn't guaranteed. One article he found described a case in California where a couple had found gold coins buried on their property and ended up in a legal battle with the state, which claimed the coins had been stolen from a government mint over a century ago. The couple had won eventually, but it had taken years and cost them tens of thousands in legal fees. Another article talked about a man in Texas who'd found cash hidden in the walls of a house he'd bought, only to have the previous owner's heirs sue him for it. That case was still ongoing. The more John read, the more complicated it seemed. There was no simple answer, no clear path forward, and that made him nervous. He closed the laptop and sat back. The smart thing to do, the responsible thing, would be to call Ed Porter and tell him what he'd found. Let Ed deal with it. Let Ed make the decisions. But the thought of doing that made John's chest tighten, because if Ed owned the gold, if the law said it belonged to the property owner, then John would get nothing. He'd go back to making his monthly payments on the credit card debt, back to worrying about money, back to putting off plans with Sarah because they couldn't afford them. And someone else, someone who hadn't put a shovel in the ground, someone who'd never even visited this property in the 3 years John had lived here, would walk away with a fortune. That didn't feel right. Maybe it was the law, but it didn't feel right. John spent the rest of the day thinking about it. He didn't go back outside, he didn't touch the gold again. He just sat and thought, weighing his options, trying to figure out the right move. By the time Sarah called that evening to ask if he wanted to grab dinner, he'd made a decision. He wasn't going to call Ed. Not yet. First, he needed to know exactly what he had. He needed to get the gold appraised, to find out its true value and purity. Because if it turned out to be worth less than he thought, or if it wasn't actually gold at all, then there was no point in starting a legal mess over it. And if it was valuable, if it was real, then he'd have more information to work with when he decided what to do next. He told Sarah he wasn't feeling great, that he'd probably just stay in for the night. She offered to bring him soup. He told her he'd be fine, that he just needed to rest. He hated lying to her, even a small lie like that, but he wasn't ready to explain yet. The next morning, John called in sick to work. He told his supervisor he had a stomach bug, which wasn't entirely untrue. His stomach had been in knots since yesterday. Then he carefully extracted the gold from the backyard again, loading it into an old duffel bag he'd kept in the closet. He drove into Sacramento to a coin and precious metals dealer he'd found online that had good reviews and seemed reputable. The shop was small, tucked into a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation office. A bell chimed when he walked in. The man behind the counter was in his 60s, bald, wearing reading glasses on a chain around his neck. His name tag said, Richard. John set the duffel bag on the counter and unzipped it slowly. "I need to have some gold appraised," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Richard looked into the bag, then looked at John, then looked back into the bag. "Where did you get this?" he asked. It was the question John had been dreading. He'd practiced an answer on the drive over. "It's been in my family," he said. "My grandfather's. He passed away a few years ago and I've been going through his things." It wasn't entirely a lie. His grandfather had passed away. The rest was just misdirection. Richard seemed to accept it. He nodded and pulled out a set of scales and a jeweler's loupe. "Let me take a look," he said. The appraisal took almost 2 hours. Richard weighed each piece, tested its purity using a small electronic device, and made notes on a pad of paper. John sat in a chair by the window and tried not to look anxious. At one point, a woman came in to sell some old silver dollars, and Richard paused to help her, which meant John had to sit there even longer, watching the duffel bag on the counter and wondering if he'd made a huge mistake bringing it here. What if Richard called the police? What if he suspected the gold was stolen? But Richard didn't call anyone. He finished with the woman, went back to the gold and continued his work methodically and without comment. When he was finally done, Richard took off his glasses and looked at John. "You've got about 7.5 pounds here," he said. "The purity varies. Some of it's close to pure, probably 23 or 24 carat. Some of it's got more impurities, maybe 18 or 19 carat. Overall, I'd estimate you're looking at around 95% pure gold by weight." He scribbled some numbers on the pad. "At current market rates, the melt value is approximately $228,000. John felt the words hit him like a physical force. $228,000. He'd underestimated. He'd thought it might be 150,000, maybe a little more, but he hadn't expected this. Richard was still talking. "Now that's melt value, meaning if you sold it to a refinery. If you wanted to sell it privately, you might get more. Some collectors pay a premium for raw gold, especially if it's from a known region or has historical significance. But I'd say 230,000 is a solid baseline." John nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Richard leaned back against the counter. "If you're looking to sell, I can make you an offer. I'd need to verify everything and run some more tests, but I could go as high as 210,000 cash today." John's mind raced. 210,000 cash. Today. It was tempting, unbelievably tempting, but something held him back. If Richard was offering 210, that meant he thought he could sell it for more, maybe significantly more. And if John waited, if he found the right buyer, he might be able to get closer to the full value. Plus, there was still the question of ownership. If he sold it now before figuring out the legal side, and it turned out later that someone else had a claim to it, he could be in serious trouble. "I need to think about it," John said. Richard nodded, unsurprised. "Take your time. But if you're serious about selling, don't wait too long. Gold prices fluctuate. What's worth 230 today could be worth 200 tomorrow, or it could be worth 250. You never know." John thanked him, zipped the gold back into the duffel bag and left. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long time, just staring at the bag on the passenger seat. $228,000. It was more money than he'd ever imagined having. It was enough to pay off his debt, Sarah's debt, and still have over 200,000 left. It was enough to put a down payment on a house, to start a business, to completely change the trajectory of his life, but only if he could keep it. And right now he had no idea if that was possible. Over the next few days, John did more research. He read everything he could find about treasure trove laws, about property rights, about found valuables. He read about cases that had gone to court, about people who'd won and people who'd lost. The picture that emerged was complicated and inconsistent. In California, the law generally favored the property owner, but there were exceptions. If the person who'd buried the gold could be identified, or if their heirs could be found, they might have a claim. If the gold had been stolen, the original owner or their descendants might have a claim. But if none of that applied, if the gold was truly abandoned and the owner unknown, then it could potentially belong to the finder under treasure trove doctrine. The problem was, there was no way to know which scenario applied without more information about where the gold had come from and who had buried it. John started looking into the history of the property. The house had been built in 1972 by a man named Robert Hayes, according to county records. Hayes had lived there until 1987, when he'd sold it to a family named the Johnsons. The Johnsons had owned it for about 15 years before selling to Ed Porter's uncle in 2002. Ed had inherited it in 2018. That was a lot of owners, a lot of potential sources for the gold. Any of them could have buried it. Or it could have been there before the house was built, left by someone who'd owned the land even earlier. Grass Valley had a history of gold mining going back to the 1850s during the California gold rush. It wasn't impossible that someone had stashed gold here over a century ago and never come back for it. The more John dug into the history, the more he realized he wasn't going to find a clear answer. There were too many unknowns, too many gaps in the record. He could hire a lawyer, try to get a legal opinion on ownership, but that would cost money he didn't have, and it would mean revealing the gold's existence to more people. Every person who knew about it was another potential risk, another person who might claim it or report it or cause problems. He was stuck in a kind of paralysis, unable to move forward, but also unable to go back. The gold sat in the duffel bag in his bedroom closet, hidden behind old jackets and boxes of things he never used. Every time he walked past the closet, he felt a mixture of excitement and dread. Sarah noticed something was off. She asked him a few times if everything was okay, if something was bothering him. He told her it was just work stress, that they were short-staffed at the warehouse and he'd been picking up extra shifts. She seemed to accept that, but he could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. He hated keeping this from her. They'd been together for almost 4 years. They talked about everything. But this was different. This was bigger than anything they'd dealt with before, and he didn't know how to bring her into it, without making her complicit in whatever legal grey area he was navigating. Then, about a week after he'd found the gold, something happened that forced his hand. He came home from work one evening to find a notice taped to his front door. It was from Ed Porter. The rent was going up. Starting next month, his monthly payment would increase by $250. The notice cited rising property taxes and maintenance costs. It was legal, John knew that. The lease allowed for rent increases with proper notice, but it was also a gut punch. $250 a month was an extra $3,000 a year. That was money he didn't have, not without cutting something else from his budget, and it came at the worst possible time, when he was sitting on a fortune he might not be able to touch. He called Ed that night. "I got your notice," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. Ed sounded apologetic but firm. "Yeah, I'm sorry about that, John. I know it's not great timing, but the property taxes went up significantly this year, and I've got some repairs I need to make to the roof. I've got to cover those costs somehow." John asked if there was any flexibility, any way to negotiate. Ed said no. The increase was necessary. If John couldn't afford it, Ed understood, but he'd need to give notice and move out. They talked for a few more minutes, but it was clear Ed wasn't going to budge. When John hung up, he felt a kind of cold clarity settle over him. He was out of time. He couldn't keep waiting, couldn't keep hoping for a perfect answer that wasn't going to come. He needed to make a decision. That night he finally told Sarah. She came over after work and he sat her down in the living room and explained everything. The garden, the box, the gold, the appraisal, the legal uncertainty. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something like awe. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I see it?" He brought out the duffel bag and showed her. She picked up one of the larger nuggets and turned it over in her hands, the same way he'd done when he first found it. "This is insane," she said softly. "This is actually insane." They talked for hours that night, going over every option, every possible outcome. Sarah was more pragmatic than John had expected. She didn't immediately tell him to call Ed, or report it, or do the right thing. Instead, she asked questions. Who else knew about it? Just Richard, the appraiser, and he had no reason to say anything. Could anyone else claim it? Possibly, but they'd have to prove ownership, which seemed unlikely given how long it had been buried. What would happen if John just kept it and said nothing? That was the big unknown. It was risky, but so was every other option. Sarah's position was simple. If no one else was looking for the gold, if no one else even knew it existed, then maybe John was the rightful owner by virtue of having found it. Possession was 9/10 of the law, or so the saying went, but there was still the question of Ed. And that's when Sarah suggested something John hadn't considered. "What if you tell him?" she said. "But not about the gold. Just tell him you found something valuable on the property and you want to work out an arrangement." John frowned. What kind of arrangement? Sarah thought for a moment. "You could offer to buy the house. Tell him you found something that makes the property worth more to you than it is to him, and you want to purchase it outright. That way the property becomes yours, and whatever's on it or in it becomes yours too." It was a risky play, John thought. If Ed got suspicious, if he started asking too many questions, the whole thing could fall apart. But it also had a certain logic to it. Ed had never shown much interest in the property beyond collecting rent. If John offered him a fair price, maybe even a generous price, Ed might jump at it. And once John owned the property, the legal uncertainty around the gold would disappear. It would be his land, his discovery, his fortune. There'd be no landlord to split it with, no potential competing claims. It would be clean. The next day, John called Ed again. He told him he'd been thinking about the rent increase and had a different proposal. He wanted to buy the house. Ed sounded surprised. "Buy it? You're serious?" John said he was. He explained that he'd been thinking about settling down, about putting down roots, and that the property, despite its flaws, had grown on him. He asked what Ed would want for it. Ed said he'd need to think about it, that he'd have to get an appraisal and figure out a fair price. They agreed to talk again in a few days. A week later, Ed called back with a number. He'd had the property appraised at $260,000. He'd be willing to sell for $250,000, a slight discount since it would save him the hassle of listing it with a realtor. John felt his stomach drop. $250,000. Even if he sold the gold for its full appraised value, he'd barely break even after taxes and closing costs, and that was assuming he could liquidate the gold without raising red flags. He told Ed he needed some time to think about it, to talk to the bank about a loan. Ed said that was fine, but he couldn't wait forever. If John wasn't serious, Ed needed to know so he could move forward with the rent increase. John spent the next few days doing the math over and over. If he sold the gold to Richard for $210,000, and if he could get a small mortgage to cover the remaining $40,000, he could make it work. But he'd be taking on debt again, and he'd be converting a liquid asset into an illiquid one. The house was old, it needed repairs, and it was in a rental neighborhood where property values were stagnant. It wasn't a great investment from a financial perspective, but it was a path to ownership, both of the property and of the gold's full value, and it would end the uncertainty, the constant worry about who might come forward to claim what he'd found. Sarah was more cautious now. $250,000 is a lot, she said. And you don't even know if you'll like living here long term. What if you want to move? What if we want to move? John didn't have a good answer for that. He just knew that if he didn't act now, the opportunity would slip away. Either Ed would raise the rent and John would have to move out, or Ed would start asking questions about why John suddenly wanted to buy a property he'd only been renting. The window was closing. In the end, John decided to take the risk. He contacted Richard and told him he wanted to sell the gold. Richard made the same offer as before, $210,000 cash. John accepted. The transaction took 3 days to finalize. Richard needed to verify the gold's authenticity again and arrange for the cash, which he said he'd need to pull from a bank in installments to avoid triggering reporting requirements. John didn't ask too many questions about that. He just wanted the deal done. When Richard finally handed over the money, it was in a small briefcase, bundled in stacks of hundreds. John had never seen that much cash in one place. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. He deposited the money in his checking account over the course of a week, spreading it across multiple transactions to avoid suspicion. Then he called Ed and told him he'd secured financing and was ready to move forward with the purchase. Ed sounded pleased. They agreed to meet with the title company to handle the paperwork. The closing process took about a month. There were inspections, document signings, and a few tense moments when John thought something might go wrong, that someone might ask questions he couldn't answer. But everything went smoothly. On a Thursday afternoon in early June, John signed the final documents and officially became the owner of the property on Willow Creek Road. When it was done, when the title was in his name and the keys were his, John drove back to the house and sat in the driveway for a while, just looking at it. The same faded yellow siding, the same warped fence, the same patchy backyard where he'd planted a shovel and changed his life. It didn't look any different. But everything was different. He owned it now. And more than that, he'd crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross. The gold was gone, converted into cash and then into property. There was no going back, no undoing what he'd done. For better or worse, he'd made his choice. The immediate financial impact was mixed. John had used most of the gold's value to buy the house, which meant he wasn't suddenly rich, but he'd also eliminated his credit card debt entirely, using a portion of the remaining cash to pay off the balance in full. That alone felt like a huge weight lifted. No more monthly payments, no more interest piling up. He also had about $20,000 left over, which he put into a savings account as an emergency fund. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than he'd ever had saved before. And the house, despite its flaws, was his. No more rent increases, no more landlords. If he wanted to paint the walls or tear down the fence or plant a garden, he could do it without asking permission. Sarah moved in with him a few months later. They used some of the remaining money to make small improvements. New paint, a few repairs, a better water heater. The house started to feel less like a rental and more like a home. They talked about their future with a kind of optimism that hadn't been there before. Maybe they'd flip the property eventually, sell it for a profit, and use the money to buy something bigger. Or maybe they'd stay, fix it up over time, and build equity. The point was they had options now. The gold had given them that. But John couldn't shake the feeling that he'd gotten away with something. Not stolen, exactly. He hadn't taken the gold from anyone who was looking for it. But he'd found something valuable on someone else's property and claimed it as his own without telling the property owner. Legally, it was probably defensible. He owned the property now, so even if Ed had somehow found out about the gold later, there'd be no claim he could make. But morally, ethically, it was ambiguous. John thought about it sometimes late at night, lying in bed next to Sarah, wondering if he'd done the right thing. He'd never know for sure. The only thing he knew was that the gold had been there, hidden under 8 inches of dirt for who knows how long. And if he hadn't found it, it might have stayed there forever, unclaimed and forgotten. Over the next year, John did some more research into the property's history, not out of guilt but out of curiosity. He wanted to know where the gold had come from, who might have buried it. He found a few interesting details. The land had originally been part of a larger parcel owned by a mining company in the 1860s, during the height of the gold rush. The company had gone bankrupt in 1873, and the land had been subdivided and sold off in pieces. There were stories, local legends really, about miners who'd hidden their claims or stashed their earnings in fear of theft. Some of those stashes had been found over the years, others hadn't. It was possible, maybe even likely, that the gold John had found had been buried by a miner over a century ago and simply never recovered. There was no way to prove it, but the timeline made sense. The gold hadn't been refined or processed. It was raw, the kind of thing you'd pull straight from the ground, and the way it had been buried, wrapped in old fabric in a crude wooden box, suggested someone in a hurry, someone who didn't expect to leave it there long. Maybe the miner had died before he could come back for it. Maybe he'd forgotten where he'd buried it. Or maybe he'd planned to retrieve it and never got the chance. Whatever the reason, the gold had waited there for over 100 years, through multiple owners and multiple lives, until a man planting a vegetable garden had driven a shovel into the dirt and brought it back into the world. John sometimes wondered what he would have done if he'd known the full story from the beginning. If he'd known the gold had belonged to some long-dead miner with no living heirs, would he have felt differently about keeping it? Probably not. Dead men don't need gold. But the question lingered anyway, a small nagging doubt that surfaced every now and then. He'd made peace with his decision, or at least convinced himself he had. The gold had changed his life. It had given him stability, security, a foundation he could build on. And, in a strange way, it had taught him something about value, about the way opportunities can hide in plain sight, buried under the surface of ordinary life, waiting for someone to notice them. Sarah never doubted the decision. She saw it as pragmatic, as making the best of an unexpected situation. "You didn't take it from anyone," she told him once when he brought it up. "You found it, and you put it to good use." She was right, in a way. The gold had been doing nothing buried in the ground. Now it had been converted into something functional, a home, a future, a chance to move forward. That had to count for something. By the time a year had passed since the discovery, John had almost stopped thinking about it. The gold was gone, integrated into his life in ways that made it invisible. The house was just a house. The savings account was just a number on a screen. The debt he'd paid off was just a memory. Life had returned to a kind of normalcy, the kind where the extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition and time. He still worked at the warehouse. Sarah still worked her job at a local clinic. They talked about taking a vacation, maybe going to Hawaii or Mexico, something they'd never been able to afford before. They talked about getting a dog. Small, normal things. The gold had made those things possible, but it had also faded into the background, a story they told themselves sometimes but didn't dwell on. There was one moment, though, about 18 months after he'd found the gold, that brought it all back to the surface. John was at a hardware store buying supplies for a backyard project. Sarah wanted to build a small deck, and he'd agreed to help. While he was waiting in line to check out, he overheard two men talking behind him. One of them was telling the other about a news story he'd read, about a couple in Northern California who'd found a cache of gold coins buried on their property. The couple had reported the find and ended up in a legal battle with the federal government, which claimed the coins had been stolen from a mint in the 1800s. The case was still ongoing, the man said, and the couple had spent over $100,000 in legal fees. "Can you believe that?" the man said. "They find a fortune and end up broke because of it." John didn't turn around. He just stood there, holding his lumber and bags of concrete mix, listening. The other man laughed and said something about how you couldn't win either way, how the system was rigged. The first man agreed. "If I ever found something like that," he said, "I'd keep my mouth shut and sell it quietly. Nobody needs to know." The second man laughed again. "Yeah, but you'd get caught. They always get caught." John paid for his supplies and left. He didn't think about the conversation again until later that night, when he and Sarah were sitting on the back porch, drinking beer and watching the sun set over the fence line. He told her what he'd heard. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you think we did the right thing?" It was the first time she'd asked that question directly. John thought about it. "I think we did the only thing we could do," he said. "If we'd reported it, we'd be in the same situation as that couple. Broke and fighting the government. This way, we get to actually use it. We get to live with it." Sarah nodded. "Yeah," she said. "I think you're right." They didn't talk about it again after that. The gold became what it had been from the beginning, a secret, something they carried between them, known only to the two of them and to Richard, the appraiser who'd probably seen 100 similar situations and had no incentive to say anything. It was a quiet kind of fortune, one that didn't announce itself, that didn't draw attention, and maybe that was the best kind, the kind that changed your life without defining it, the kind that gave you options without dictating your choices. John never planted the vegetable garden. The backyard remained mostly bare, just a patch of dirt and weeds that he mowed occasionally to keep the neighbors from complaining. Sometimes he looked at the spot where the gold had been buried and tried to imagine the person who'd put it there, the hands that had dug the hole and placed the box and covered it with soil. He wondered if that person had planned to come back for it, if they'd died knowing it was still there, unclaimed. He wondered if they'd be angry or relieved to know someone had finally found it. Probably a little of both, he thought. In the end, John decided that the gold had been a kind of gift, not from any one person, but from time itself, from the randomness of history. It had been waiting there for over a century, hidden under layers of dirt and forgetfulness, until the right moment came along, the right person, the right shovel stroke. And once it was found, it became his responsibility to decide what to do with it. He'd made his choice, he'd taken the risk, and whether it was the right choice or the wrong choice, it was his. That was the thing about fortune, he realized. It didn't come with instructions, it didn't come with guarantees, it just came. And what you did with it, how you handled it, that was up to you. Sarah often said that finding the gold was the best thing that ever happened to them, but John wasn't entirely sure about that. It had been the most unexpected thing, certainly, the most impactful. But the best? He didn't know. The gold had solved problems, yes. It had cleared debt and bought property and created stability, but it had also created new kinds of stress, new kinds of questions. It had forced them to make decisions they'd never imagined having to make, to navigate legal and ethical territory they didn't fully understand. And it had left them with a secret they'd carry for the rest of their lives, a story they could never fully tell. Maybe that was the real cost of the fortune. Not money, but the weight of knowing, the burden of what they'd chosen to do with what they'd found. Still, when John looked at his life now compared to what it had been 3 years ago, he couldn't deny the difference. He had a house, he had savings, he had the freedom to make choices without constantly worrying about money. That was worth something. Maybe it was worth everything. And if the price of that was a secret buried in the backyard, a story never fully told, then maybe that was a price worth paying. He didn't know. He'd probably never know. But he knew this. He'd taken a chance, made a decision, and lived with the consequences. That was more than a lot of people could say. One evening, almost 2 years to the day after he'd first driven a shovel into the ground, John and Sarah were sitting in the living room when Sarah asked him if he'd ever want to move. They'd been fixing up the house slowly, room by room, and it was starting to look decent. But it was still small, still in a neighborhood that wasn't great, still the same faded structure it had always been. John thought about it. "Maybe someday," he said, "but not yet. This place means something to me. I can't really explain it, but it does." Sarah nodded. She understood. The house wasn't just a house, it was the place where their lives had changed, where a random decision to plant a garden had led to a discovery that altered everything. That kind of place, that kind of moment, it left a mark. You didn't just walk away from that, so they stayed. They kept fixing it up, kept making it theirs. And every now and then, when John walked past the spot in the backyard where the gold had been buried, he felt a small flicker of something. Not regret, not guilt, just recognition. Recognition that life could change in an instant, that fortune could be hiding anywhere, that you never really knew what was beneath the surface until you started digging. That was the lesson, if there was one, that the world was full of hidden things waiting to be found. And that sometimes, if you were lucky, if you paid attention, if you were in the right place at the right time, you might just stumble onto something that changed everything. The gold was gone now, converted into other forms, scattered across multiple uses and purposes. But its impact remained, not in any single dramatic change, but in 100 small ways. In the confidence John felt walking into his house, knowing he owned it. In the ease with which he and Sarah could plan their future without constant worry. In the quiet knowledge that they'd faced an impossible situation and found a way through it. That was the real treasure, John thought. Not the gold itself, but what it had taught them. That they were capable of more than they'd imagined. That they could make hard decisions and live with them. That sometimes taking a risk paid off. And if you asked John whether he'd do it again, whether he'd make the same choices if given another chance, he'd tell you honestly that he didn't know. Because the truth was, he'd never really know if he'd made the right call. The gold could have belonged to someone. Someone's descendants might still be out there, unaware of what had been buried on that property generations ago. Maybe they deserved it. Maybe they had a legal claim, but they didn't know about it, and John did. And in the end, that was the deciding factor. Knowledge and the willingness to act on it. That's what separated those who found fortune from those who let it slip through their fingers. John had found it. He'd acted on it. And now he lived with it, in all its complexity and ambiguity. That was his story. A man who'd been planting a garden and discovered gold. A man who'd made a choice and built a life on top of it. A man who'd learned that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough or curious enough or desperate enough to uncover them. That was him. And whatever came next, whatever twists or turns life still had in store, he'd face them knowing that he'd already survived the most unexpected turn of all. The day he drove a shovel into the dirt, and everything changed. If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that opportunity can appear in the most unexpected places. What John discovered wasn't just gold buried in his backyard. It was a reminder that life-changing moments often come disguised as ordinary days. Sometimes the difference between a regular Tuesday and the day that transforms your entire future is nothing more than paying attention to that unusual sound when metal hits wood instead of stone, and having the courage to keep digging when logic tells you it's probably nothing. If you found this story as compelling as we did, consider subscribing to Fortune Beneath. Every week, we uncover real stories of people who stumbled onto wealth they never expected, in places they never imagined. These aren't fairy tales. They're documented discoveries that changed ordinary lives forever. And each one carries lessons about awareness, decision-making, and the thin line between luck and action. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next discovery that might make you look at your own surroundings a little differently. And if you know someone who'd appreciate John's story, share this video with them. You never know what might be hiding beneath the surface of their own life, waiting to be found.